moving on to Dr. Darren Stevens. Are you there, Darren?
I am indeed.
Wonderful. So I pass the baton on to you, my friend, and take it away.
Can I share my screen?
There we go.
Oh, it's hideous. Let me just share my presentation. Can everybody see that?
I can see it. I can't speak for everybody, but I am a representative human, so I've been told.
Well, I wouldn't assume, but okay.
Look, Dr. Paul Verbas called me a representative human, so.
So you take it for granted then, that's fine. Right, so in my talk, I think, to be honest with you, after listening all day, 25% of my slides are now redundant. However, I can see questions in the chat on my right-hand side, on the right-hand screen. And what my talk is about is prerequisites for requisite agility. And I'm going to touch on some things that Jeannie said, some things that Dave said, and a couple of other things. But everybody knows what agility is because we've talked about it all day. So I've got, even though I've got a couple of these things here, I won't go through all the slides with you, but that'll save us some time and probably get us back on track for the people who are doing it. So just a quick introduction to the theory of constructed development. I created this, it's about how we think. Someone's already mentioned the word heuristics, and lots of people have mentioned socialized thinking, procedural stuff. What we've got is a bunch of 50, what I've called cognitive intentions that we use as shortcuts, heuristics in our thinking that we use unconsciously, to go back to what Jeannie said. However, I've managed to map it to the levels of adult development from a guy called Robert Keegan and another one by Otto Lasky that says, actually, if we're very, very socialized in our thinking, well, I can deconstruct that using these 50 cognitive intentions. And if we are very, very selfish, we can look at those as well. Now, Jeannie said that she could predict the behavior of the guy who would not go into the women's toilets. This is what this is predicated upon. We can deconstruct that guy's thinking and say specifically how and why he wouldn't go into those toilets. So what is constructive development theory? It's the name given to how aware we are of our construction of self. However, we construct ourselves from, within the context, within our environment, from the perspective of 50 cognitive intentions. And I'm going to come on to those as we go through. Dynamic intelligence, I wish I could trademark that. I can't, but it's the process of how we construct our self-awareness. And I left a message in the chat earlier that said, our self-awareness is measurable. And so is stage transition, and so is scaffolding, and all these other things that we talk about. Okay. Intention, awareness, choice, response are the 4 pillars of constructive development, which we use. I'm using them in many arenas, not just in self-awareness, not just in how we construct our thinking, but also in how I teach my martial art and things like this. And the 50 cognitive intentions are heuristics that are made concrete over time to become habituated thinking styles. Now, someone mentioned the word habits earlier, and basically, if you get all of these things that we've talked about so far, and they just happen for you in your thinking, and you behave accordingly, that behavior, that thinking is a habit. How aware are you in the moment of that habit and of that thinking? So we're going to go through this, and the combination of those 50 cognitive intentions is your thinking style. And we are measuring it with the awareness quotient. There are 2, actually, the thinking quotient and the awareness quotient. The thinking quotient maps to Keegan and Lasky, but the awareness quotient is all mine. And we'll talk about the rest now. So this is the framework. The difference that makes the difference is that intention, awareness, choice, response. What is your intention in the moment? How aware are you of that intention? What choices does that intention create, that awareness create? And can you change your response in the moment? So now as you think about this, where does Agile come into this? And it doesn't matter whether it's an individual, a leadership, or an organizational agility. Intention, awareness, choice, response. So I'm going to map that across in a little while. You can't read the label of the jar that you're in. I absolutely love that idea. However, the jar contains the ingredients of these 50 shortcuts that we use in our thinking. And the unique combination of these shortcuts is the content of your jar. So with the right intention, awareness, choice, and response, we can write the label on the jar for ourselves. That's got to be agile, right? So let's map it to agility. What is the lowest common denominator that unites all of these principles? People, Jeannie might say thinking, evolution, whatever. God knows what Dave would say. What's the best way to create a more agile business? And this came up earlier. Create more dynamically intelligent leaders or more dynamically intelligent people, because a more agile business evolves from an agile mind. And someone else said that that's the other way around. However, the people first. The prerequisites for agile businesses is agile thinking. And I don't mind whether you use the word agile or dynamically intelligent or whatever you want to use. So Google searching and looking into what agility is, I know I don't need to go through this with you all because it will just bore you because we've done it all day. But the operational agility of an organization is dependent upon these, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, because these are the words. VUCA comes up a lot when you look at agility. Can we make VUCA a conscious choice? Can we understand it in a different way? What I did was, I'm thinking about how intention maps to VUCA. You know, without knowing one's intention, we open our thinking to uncertainty. And without our awareness of our intention, with our awareness of our intention leads to either uncertainty or ambiguity if it's not known to the person. And then our choices, our capacity to choose our response in the moment is derived from our level of awareness. And this requires complexity, but might also lead to ambiguity if we're not aware. And then from a response perspective, how we respond in the moment is going to depend on our awareness of our intention, which again maps to our complexity, but I'll map it for you as we go through. People talked about throughout the whole day, agile people. Please don't read any of this. I will give you the slides. I will give you all of the slides and the notes. You don't have to read any of it. Okay, it's just a conversation starter. So have you heard of the Barnum effect or the Forer effect? At what point did someone say no?
No, haven't.
So Jordy, you serious? I'm going to explain it if you haven't.
I mean, the Barna effect or the Forer effect? Barnum.
So the guy who did the circus, Barnum,
Okay.
P.T. Barnum, yeah, he created a profile of people, and it was so vague and so generic that it applied to everybody. But when you gave it to someone, they said, "Oh wow, that is me. That's me." However, when you pass it to the next person, you realize it's exactly the same horoscope, personality profile, whatever you want to call it. That's the Barnum effect. It's when you write something so vague that it applies almost everywhere. What I want to know is, because I'm not the expert on this, what I want to know is there an element of Barnum effect or Forer effect? Forer did it first, that's all. When we talk about agile. So you guys can say it in the chat, or we can talk about it afterwards. So when we talk about agile people, what springs to my mind is, what if the people have different levels of self-awareness? What if they have less capacity to make a choice in the moment because they're not aware of their intention? What if most of their processing, and you guys know people like this, they react emotionally immediately, angrily perhaps. Maybe they put, someone tries to overtake them in a car and they put their foot down because they don't want to be overtaken, but they're not conscious of the fact they're doing this. It's an habituated response in the moment. So from an emotional perspective, somebody who acts and reacts angrily to something, that's a standard condition response for them. But can they stop doing it? If you raise their awareness, can they stop doing it? You might say they're not agile. And I'm giving you an emotional perspective and a driving car perspective. But if you put these kinds of people into a team in an organization and you have 10 people, 2 of them are at the lower level of my scale there, but 8 of them are at the higher level, say AQ 8, 9, you're going to get what's called an upwardly divided team bilaterally. And if you do it the other way around, where only 2 people are high level and the rest of them are lower level, you've got a completely different team environment. So this is going towards what Dave said and people like, and what we've said all day, really. When you look at the organizational perspective of people, how can they all be agile when they have different levels of self-awareness, when their own personal agility is not there? That's the question I would ask, okay? So when we look at it from a cultural perspective, I'm just listening, I'm reading Sean's bit there. Yeah, that kind of thing. So agile culture. Now, Ginny said something about culture. Who here, in all of you guys sitting here, who thinks that they can step out of their culture so that it doesn't impact their thinking at all, right? Now, I ask this of my students when I'm teaching. I teach undergrad and masters and whatnot. And I ask my students the same question. And they pretty much say, no, they can't. They think their culture, their family, their whatever impacts their thinking. So when we talk about it from an organizational culture perspective, yes, the organizational culture is constructed and it's artificial, but how much does it impact us? So in my research, in my study, Marty says not possible. That's the general response I get, exactly. What if we look at this, if we look at the profile system that I use to determine someone's level of self-awareness and how they construct their thinking in the moment. This one person here, I've got a lot of data on this, but this is just for you guys. They did the profile in English and then they did the profile in Indonesian. And the way they construct their thinking conforms to cultural stereotypes. And the best one I've got, I really should have put this one in, is a German guy who is also Spanish. And in the German profile, he conforms to the German cultural stereotypes, but in the Spanish profile, he conforms to the Spanish profile, you know, a bit more laissez-faire, a bit more relaxed with time, that kind of thing. Whereas from a German perspective, much more ordered and procedural, that kind of thing. So for me, when we look at any kind of culture, how do we know that it's impacting us? And can we choose not to have it impact our thinking? Is that personal agility? Is that moving agility around in an organization? Can we really think about our thinking in context to the point where we can detach from whatever's around us? So for me, that's going to start with how we construct our thinking. And if you want to be in an organization and agile, it's going to come down from the leadership. But then we just go back to this slide here and say, well, how does that thinking of different levels of awareness impact leadership? Okay. The essence of requisite agility is in building leadership in organizations. Okay. The agility of leaders is in sustaining balance between the rates of change in teams, business and societal agility. These are quotes I've got from the literature that I found, okay? Failure occurs when these 4 realms of requisite agility are kept separate, okay? So what unites and separates requisite agility? And what does an agile leader within the framework of my CDT look like? Well, we've already had a definition of complexity versus complicated, and I've got another slide on it in a little while, which I don't really need to do because you've already had it. But leadership responsibilities look different at each level, okay? And the one bit that I like here is the complexity of the task. Michael Commons talks about that. However, in my research, in my thesis, I talk about how actually the task isn't the complexity part, and Commons got it wrong. The complexity part is the thinking before the task. Okay, so decision-making power, authority over resources, meaning and scope of change, all of these things, okay, that we need to have different levels of leadership and different levels of organizations will determine what kind of leader will create what kind of organization. For example, somebody at the higher levels might create a more social enterprise because they're not necessarily bothered about profit. They're not really worried about, making so much money, but they are more concerned about everyone benefiting from it. Whereas at the lower levels, it might be, well, I'm going to focus on my money and I'm going to focus on, thank you, Pavel, that's a nice comment. But at the lower levels, it might be, well, what's in it for me now? And how do I make more money for me right now? Now. Well, you will probably understand that that's going to create a completely different kind of organization than somebody who's not necessarily worried about profit. So where does agility come into? These two kinds of ideas. And I put Elon Musk at AQ8. He could even be AQ9, but we can talk about that in the breakout room. Because he's the kind of guy like Steve Jobs who said, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to leave a legacy. You will buy my stuff. You will buy it. And what I've got here, for all the people who are wondering about what this really means, this is an amalgamation of about 50 leaders. I've done I've probably done about 10 years of research on this as well as a PhD. And this is kind of an idea of how it is to lead at a decent level. So the leadership profile there is Keegan, above Keegan's level 4. And on my one, they're above level 7, which is good thinking. So we could essentially map what a leader looks like to this and say, well, actually, where they might not come into it, where their thinking might be marginally different, what do we need to tweak or change? And I can explain to you how we do look at the differences and potentially something called intervention. So somebody who, global thinking, for example, big picture, Dave mentioned it, Jeannie mentioned all this. These are just the shortcuts that look at how we look at information in coming into us. So global is big picture. Detail is obviously the opposite. Abstract, we talked about that as well. Abstraction in this case is measurable. How is your capacity to go abstract in your thinking, to go one step out, that kind of thing? Or do you prefer to be, more concrete? Who, where, what, why, when, and how? So all of this is as just one of these cognitive intentions. So what I did was, from this kind of idea here, what I've said is, look, this is what a highly dynamically intelligent leader looks like. However, I have no problem with you using the word agile. Okay, so if we say somebody who adapts to change easily, well, instead of it just being a platitude, we can map it to specific cognitive intentions. Okay, I'll put that there. Interested in everyone's opinion, we can map it to specific cognitive intentions. And the difference between these cognitive intentions is your measure of your self-awareness. So this person, from internal, external, relatively flat, which means that they're relatively at choice in whether they listen to you or take on board their own opinion. Now, for me, an agile leader, somebody who's a high-level leader, knows his own mind or her own mind, but can take on board your perspective too. That kind of thing. If you're able to see the bigger picture, we just mentioned that one. Capable of seeing the long-term ramifications, which is Elliot Jacques and his span of discretion, that kind of thing. Okay, and someone mentioned it probably about 5 talks ago, but we were talking about risk. And I'm actually involved in a research project right now based on risk for stockbrokers, that kind of thing. It's very interesting. But it's not about whether you're risk aware, risk averse. It's about your choice, your capacity to choose whether you take risk or not. It's exactly the same. Geordie, can I help?
We've got Andreas asking adaptation to what kind of change, what order, what type? Do you want to address Andreas right away?
I'll give it a go. Adaptation to which kind of change? Are we talking, is your question, Andreas, about organizational change, individual change, or contextual change?
It is all kinds of change. First order change, second order change, third order change, or fourth order change. Fourth order change is globally. First order change is just tweaking the system.
Yes, sir. So if you now go back to this here, in order to understand the fourth order change, is someone capable of a global perspective? Are they also capable of change? Or are they up here, options, procedures down the bottom, or are they not capable of change sameness and difference. So you can combine from the entire profile, you can map to the 4 different kinds of change and determine whether someone is or is not capable of, 1, seeing the change, and 2, mapping to the change. But more importantly, if you can see because you can see my slide, if I do this, that person there is not capable of doing the change. That's the point. This person, if we change this around, this person here only likes change, which means they could also be disruptive. Okay, so you take the profile in its entirety and you map them across it, and you'll get the answer to your 4 different kinds of change. Good question, thank you. So that's the idea. Not just leaders, not just organizations, not just change, but how people think and construct their thinking in the moment, how self-aware they are, is measurable. And for anybody who wants to know the science behind it, I have 8,200 profiles supporting the hypothesis and backing up the entire theory. It's not based on 20 or 30 people, 8,000 of them. So if we think about this, so what is this conference all about? And what this conference has allowed me to do is to think about and consider my theory in a context other than its intended or research-based, thinking. It's given me a platform to adapt my thinking to an agile perspective. Okay. So I've approached it from the perspective of what comes first, whether you have agile people, agile organizations, agile systems, what comes first? And ultimately, obviously, I'm going to determine that it's dynamic intelligence, which we can look at. Please don't read these. They are just for your information. But agile companies, for example, strive to be open-minded and adaptable. Well, first of all, what does open-minded mean? What does adaptable mean? So what they say is, they often hit a roadblock when it comes to their employees. Employees must have positive emotions. They must be engaged. It's all about relationships. What is the meaning that we create? And I could do an exercise with you where we look at the word chocolate, and you will have a different meaning to the word chocolate than me. Completely different. I won't do it though. And then we've got things where you do a little bit of research in Google, because that's not real research, I appreciate that. 11 skills and attitudes that can increase resilience, which comes up a lot in agility, but this was developed by somebody who doesn't know necessarily about levels of adult development. So what do? We think about what makes someone or a company agile and what makes the company resilient and map it to constructive development theory. So same kind of question as, thank you for the first order, Andreas, all of that stuff there. So basically, just going back to what Andreas said, we can map to how, if we go back to that one there, if these are really and truly, and you guys being agile people, understand this better than I do and know what it is to be connected to others, flexible, able to communicate well, then constructive development theory can measure all of that. So if you said to me, Darren, we need to go into an organization and we've got 50 people on a team, we can measure all 50 of them and get 50 profiles and determine just how connected they are, just how communicative they are, how well do they communicate, and how flexible are they, using the 50 shortcuts that we have here. I've done it here as well. How self-confident are they? Well, words like self-confidence and self-esteem don't really mean a lot, especially self-esteem, because there's no self in it. Esteem in this instance is about an external locus of evaluation. So really and truly, how self-confident are you depends on whether you care about what other people think. And we can measure that. So, being able to see the big picture, well, we can measure that. Being able to take care of yourself, we can measure that too. Now, if you work in a service industry like a nurse or something like that, you're going to expect a nurse, in exactly the same way that Jeannie said she could predict the behavior of the German CEO, you're going to expect nurses to have a specific way of thinking, a specific thinking style. And I've got the data on it and I've got loads of slides on it somewhere else. We've only got half an hour here. So we can predict their thinking, we can predict their behaviors. So the question I've got for you guys is, does a nurse become a nurse because of the way she thinks? Or does she think that way because she's a nurse? And if it's the latter, how agile can she be? And I've said she because predominantly they're women. However you look at it, the data is women. Okay. Are you doing the job you do because of how you think? And if you're not aware of that, can you step out of it so that it doesn't impact your construction of self, so that you might become more agile in your thinking in the moment? I hope that makes sense. There you go. Look, there's a nurse profile if you really want to look at one like that. So requisite, CDT is essentially the conduit between constructivism, which is people themselves internally, and constructionism, which is the external environment. Okay, so requisite means made necessary by particular circumstances, and agility means the ability to think, move easily, and understand quickly. We can measure that. Requisite is situational. But how does the situation impact our thinking? Mike says a bad system can turn a nurse into an uncaring person very quickly. You are absolutely right, Mike, and you have predicted my next slide. Stop it. What we don't realize is just that everything is an environment, Mike, from your perspective there. A prerequisite for requisite agility is that the individual is capable. But if the environment changes, as Mike just said, how does this impact the agile leader's capacity to lead? How does it impact the employees, the agile people's capacity to perform? Well, with these, this is basically 4 profiles of one person over, let's pretend, 10 years. Riding high in the first profile, this person loved it. However, 3 years later, they get divorced. Their thinking changes. Okay, their thinking changes. Divorce is an environment, and exactly as Mike says, I'm not sure that's the point, Syed. However, once this person had got rid of whoever they were divorcing, 2 years later, they did another profile and they went up even higher. That is resilience. That's the one thing that we're talking about here from an agile perspective. We can measure resilience. However, not long later, their management changed and they hated it. And they went down again. I hope everybody can see the point from a CDT perspective, from a what is essentially an awareness quotient perspective. Your environment is key, and it's measurable.
It's
okay?
It's a roller coaster of love,
if you like. So let me skip on because I'm aware of the time. I won't go into too far, but basically what it looks like is at the higher levels, somebody at the lower levels cannot see your patterns. They can't see how you think. They can't construct you the way they construct themselves. That's an issue in and out of organizations. That's an issue for leaders, but also an issue for people in teams. Okay, so what we see a lot of is agile coaching. Because if you want to grow someone up a level, then get an agile coach. What does it mean? Well, if an agile coach is similar to an action coach in the sense that the goal potentially might be to become more agile, well, that's a process and we can measure procedures. However, what if I'm not procedural? I'm not procedural at all. So people might use a grow, the grow system here, which you get in the main coaching organizations, but grow cannot be agile because there's no deviation. Where's the flexibility? So what I created was something called Coaching 2.0, where we look at it's not the problem. The problem is not the problem, which is Captain Jack Sparrow. The problem is how they think about the problem. So what I said on one of the chats earlier was that the way the person constructs the problem is derived from their level of their own construction. And if they're down here at the level at my AQ5, somebody at AQ8 won't even see that problem as a problem because they will construct it completely differently. That's the premise behind Coaching 2.0, and that's out there in the world right now, and it's used as a benchmark, much more useful than things like the ICF and things like this, who just pump out anybody as a coach. This actually has an ethical framework involved in it that says, actually, if you're at AQ5, you can't coach people at a higher level than you. We need to develop your thinking, that kind of thing. We won't go into detail about it, but this, for me, is a much more useful way of looking at coaching than assigning a label like Agile to it, because that doesn't actually mean anything to me. I won't go into that because you've done it. I do have the relationship to VUCA from a specific levels perspective using my framework. I will send you the information. You don't have to read it. How do we grow people? We have a 3 leaders program. And what we do is we walk people through, a team of people through bespoke scenarios at the different levels. By the time they get to day 2, they recognize the thinking has changed and they start to grow with the thinking. It doesn't mean they're going to live there, but it does mean that by day 4, when we go up to the next level, they're stretched, they're moving, their thinking is changing. And it's a good program. I like it and people like it. Finally, then I'll move on to the last bit. And don't forget, you can have the slides. There is no truth. Everything we've talked about today is not true. Nothing we've said, nothing Dave said is true. Nothing I've said is true. If you can accept that, we're off to a good start. You can read that yourselves. That's the way I see Agile and Fragile. And there's a couple of people that I've been quoting. From a fragility perspective, you're not aware of your intention and your awareness. And when you're Agile, you have choice and response. We go back to the very beginning of the talk where I mapped my stuff with VUCA and agility.
So Darren, I want to just thank you. I mean, you've unfrozen or unlocked us from all these models and actually provided an approach through your work to bring us back to our individuality, to our uniqueness, to our diversity, whatever word we want to put. And I want to thank you for that, because it's so frustrating to move from these model to models. They're like shackles. And so, yeah, there's a lot here, a lot more than half an hour can allow for, but thank you for just your work overall, your body of work, and bringing us to a space where we can start to move to agility in a real sense, both as organizations and as people.